Hi guys, Swordmaster here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an artist and a history buff. And as far as history is concerned, my main area of expertise is American history from around the Age of Exploration onward to roughly the Cold War. I specialize in James Madison and the War of 1812 in particular, and I do occasionally dabble in medieval Europe and such like that. And I do have a degree in history, in case you are wondering. And say hello to my avatar. He's been the face of my art side of the channel for a bit. And in case you don't know who he is, he's an OC of mine, the main protagonist from an upcoming manga that I'll be releasing, or at least the first edition that I will be releasing, hopefully sometime soon. Not just not sure where I'm going to publish it. Meanwhile, he'll be acting as my avatar. Anyway, so I constantly encounter takes on history that I find often in my usual haunts of Reddit and YouTube that are, sometimes they're truly something to behold. So far, it's been kind of frustrating not being able to respond in any meaningful way because I see so much of it and there's just nothing I can do. So I decided to stop shouting into the abyss and try to make some response videos from uh, whenever I find takes in history that are just bizarre or just flat out wrong. And I could use, in case you can't tell, I could use some practice with my diction and my script reading skills, so to speak, because it's not the best in the world. Ever since I took a voice and diction class in college, I don't know what happened to my speaking voice. It's just bad now. I don't understand. It just makes me sad. So I'm trying to practice here. So bear with me if I occasionally slur my words or something. So anyway, so let's get right into what I'll be responding to here. Um, the other day, by other day I do mean quite a few months ago because it's been a while since I've been able to actually get this video together because I have been very busy. I ran across a video on YouTube from the Epic History channel called, excuse me, American Presidents: A Complete Timeline, Washington to Cleveland. And so this fellow named, well, that was Daft, an Englishman, if I'm guessing correctly, probably given that the word daft is more of an English term. He complained in the comments that the United States was the aggressor during the War of 1812. And let's read his comment here. I'd hazard a minor quibble about the Madison description. The U.S. was, by any reasonable standard, the aggressor in 1812, opportunistically capitalizing on Britain being tied up in the more important Napoleonic Wars to make a land grab. Far from it being to protect American rights at sea, the case for war was retroactively changed to that of impressment once it became known that Britain had already repealed the Orders in Council of 1807 that America had claimed as the reason for it. America was on the warpath and did not want to negotiate the matter peacefully, despite the British already having made concessions and willing to make more, as evidenced by the fact that impressment, the retroactive casus belli, was repealed before the war's end rather than as the terms of peace. Um, so at this point, I would like to ask people not to uh, harass this person. Well, that was daft in any way. The internet is a dark, nasty, gloomy place, so let's not add to any of the negativity. But that being said, though, well, that was daft. Your comment was indeed rather on the daft side. So let's break this down a bit. To begin with, he makes the assertion that the United States, see if I can find it here, opportunistically capitalized on Britain being tied up in the more important Napoleonic Wars to make a land grab. Well, to begin with, making land grabs as a prize of war was a kind of a standard practice. Nations practiced it on each other constantly. Notable examples would be the British taking Canada from the French as a prize of war at the end of the Seven Years' War, which we call the French and Indian War here in America. You also could point out the land grabs that the Allies made against the Axis powers at the end of World War One, and there's also the territorial acquisitions that the United States made at the end of the Revolutionary War. And these are just a few examples. So, with this in mind, it really doesn't come as a surprise that the United States hoped to seize a part, if not all, of Canada as a prize of war, but this was not official administrative policy. Um, well, that was Daft's comment seems to come from a classic British perspective of the whole. I could probably show you a video here of a British historian summarizing this pretty nicely, but it's basically the whole you quote stabbed us in the back kind of idea. But who says that the United States supported the coalition over France? What makes you think that the United States saw the coalition as being an ally of some kind, some back we could stab? Because the truth is, the United States itself was divided on this topic, with most Americans being more sympathetic to the French over the British and her allies. If you're wondering why we would have been more sympathetic to the French, the reason is because the average American perceived both the coalition against Napoleon and Napoleon himself as examples of tyranny of different sorts, with only one, France, which represented any kind of hope for further revolution in Europe, as opposed to the coalition, who all represented a form of the old status quo. So the United States was actually inclined to be more sympathetic to France, since her fall would spell the end of revolution in Europe. It is important to note that Napoleon was neither terribly friendly toward the United States himself, nor was he really truly any kind of classical liberal himself, even if he did lay the groundwork for future self governments across Europe. A few Americans really cared for him in particular, but they still had high hopes for France as a force for revolution, not just within our own borders, but also elsewhere. Napoleon's failure to start an empire in the New World also rendered him of no real military threat to the United States at the time, as opposed to when he acquired New Orleans from the Spanish, which was a really scary thing for Americans at the time. But once we purchased that territory from France, then in like 1803, then he was no longer a real military threat to us. So this explains why America was more an actual neutral country when it came to the war. We didn't really favor either side. We were more sympathetic to the French, but not really sympathetic to Napoleon. It was the violation of this neutrality on both sides that really pushed the United States towards war against one of the two belligerents. And as already mentioned, it just made more sense to fight the British. Uh, because the British was the chief threat to our own home interests, and they also were violating our sovereignty. So next, the commenter he makes the following claim. Far from it being to protect American rights at sea, the case for war was retroactively changed to that of impressment once it became known that Britain had already repealed the Orders in Council of 1807 that America had claimed as the reason for it. I'm sorry, but this is just palpably false in every respect. The United States had been complaining loudly about the British practice of impressment of American sailors for about 2 decades, I believe, at this point, since it was around 1792 when the practice actually began. 20 years of long suffering before the war even began. The United States almost went to war against England during the Chesapeake Affair back in 1807 under Thomas Jefferson over this very issue. So it wasn't like we suddenly decided that impressment was extremely important to us once the Orders in Council of 1807 was dropped. So by 1812, reasons for going to war against the British was threefold, and I'll list them in order of importance. Number one, denying neutrality rights. Number two, impressment of American sailors. And number three, British support of Native Americans in the Northwest Territory. Now, make no mistake about it, it's not like the British were some kind of progressive country supporting the rights of indigenous peoples against some conquering, colonizing Western power. That's not what it was at all. The British merely saw the Commonwealth Confederacy as a thorn in America's side and merely wanted to support them for that purpose. Um, it was never over just one issue why America went to war against Britain. In addition, the Orders in Council was repealed in London just after the war was declared, but not before news had a chance to make it across the Atlantic. If it had, things may have been different. Right here, I would like to clarify and inform why exactly impressment of American sailors was so insufferable to the United States, because it wasn't just mere kidnapping, and why the British were annoyed with British sailors on American ships. This is kind of complicated, but we'll try to break this down. So keep in the forefront of your mind that in England there was a national policy that any British subject, usually sailors caught idling on docks, or if I remember correctly, this could even happen in a public house. Anybody could be forced into the British Navy in a legal process known as impressment, and press gangs regularly did just that. However, such a process was naturally only legal to perform on British subjects, of course, uh, but conditions for a British sailor were notoriously bad, and it was not unusual for British sailors to jump ship to join an American crew for higher pay and better living conditions. So this was quite common. So the British took it upon themselves to stop American vessels in international waters to hunt for their missing sailors or any British subject they could find to fill much needed vacancies in their fleet, which was their chief line of defense in their death struggle against Napoleon. So typically, British officers would use any excuse possible, and sometimes Americans were just taken with no excuse whatsoever, to declare any sailor they found to be really a British subject, and thus impress them into their navy. Consequently, many Americans would go on to fight in the British Navy against the French. Most notable example of this is the 22 American sailors who were forced to fight the French at the Battle of Trafalgar on board the HMS Victoria. Between 2,500 to 25,000 Americans were thusly forced into British service. If you adjust that for population increases over the past 200 or so years, that would be the rough equivalent of something like 117,000 to 1.1 million Americans being forced into a foreign navy to fight a foreign war today. Effectively, the British were violating international law and the national sovereignty of the United States. Next, the commenter finishes with this. Truly, it's an absurd statement. Um, America was on the warpath and did not want to negotiate the matter peacefully, despite the British already having made concessions and was willing to make more, as evidenced by the fact that impressment, the retroactive casus belli, was repealed before the war's end rather than as the terms of peace. I'm sorry, but please, my good sir, please just stop before I have an aneurysm, please. I'm sorry, but the United States eagerly made multiple attempts to end the war early, especially once it became apparent that a quick end to the war was out of the cards. It was actually the British that proved mostly stubborn at this point, but more on that later. These quote unquote concessions he mentions were made right before the war was declared, and as already mentioned, it was just too late to prevent it, as already mentioned. So saying that the British had ended impressment during the war, that's not true. It's patently false. It was actually part of the reason that negotiations dragged on to the end of the war, because the United States wanted desperately to force the British to at least make concessions on impressment. But they refused, since largely because they had their own goals for this war in mind, which I will be discussing in a moment. In the end, the topic was left untouched as the diplomats agreed to a status quo antebellum ending to the war in Ghent, Belgium. It was a failure to get even a concession on impressment that would lead many to judge this war inconclusive, even today. Impressment technically remained British policy for a while after the war, and there was even one specific case where some American sailors found themselves under risk of impressment in Holland, but the offending British captain soon found himself being upbraided for it by the British minister to that country. I imagine he did not want to spark more conflict with the United States, who, while achieving nothing on paper, had made it clear that they were not willing to take anything sitting down ever again. So when it comes to what this guy said in his comment, if anything, the opposite is actually true when it comes to who wanted to extend the war and who changed their wartime objectives. So once Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of the Nations and exiled to Elba, the United States offered peace since the so-called necessity for impressment had been removed with the fall of Napoleon. However, in the words of Vice Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane, quote, I have it much at heart to give them, the Americans, a complete drubbing before peace is made, when I trust their northern limits will be circumscribed and the command of the Mississippi wrested from them. Thusly, they continued the war, But this time it was not just to defend Canada, it was to humiliate the United States and to enforce territorial acquisitions of their own with other harsh terms. I imagine also not just territorial acquisitions, but also territorial limitations. Louisiana was one such target, and Lieutenant General Sir Edward Pakenham was sent to conquer it with appropriate governorship papers, at least according to word of mouth among his soldiers. But he ended up dying at New Orleans at the hands of Andrew Jackson. The British diplomats soon had to agree to a treaty securing the status quo antebellum with the American diplomats at Ghent, Belgium, since the Duke of Wellington himself had told Lord Castlereagh that dictating land grabs and other aggressive terms were simply out of the question, since the Americans had adequately held their own ground, denying the British any bargaining power. So, was the United States the aggressor in the War of 1812? Well, based on what I've outlined, I don't think you could say they were. I think the clear answer is no, especially if seen from the American perspective, and even more specifically from President Madison's. Were there early aggressive hopes for a treaty adding territory to the United States? Yes, but it was not exactly official administered policy to keep Canada. And even if they hope to keep portions of their conquests, this is consistent with the behavior of nations before and after in times of victory. If anything, the British were the aggressors in the sense that their violation of international law and violation of American sovereignty and neutrality rights that led to war in the first place. A war that the British would end, hoping to make aggressive gains of their own against the United States. So, well, folks, that just about sums up what I wanted to say. If you liked this video, please let me know. If you have anything you want to add to the discussion, please feel free to throw it in the comment section below. I always eager to learn more. And if you want me to make more of these videos, I kind of want to make more videos like this. Just let me know. So that'll be it for me today. This is Swordmaster signing off. Till next time.